very often, like, innovative transformation of urban space comes from like questioning those regulations and adapting regulations to what needs to happen.
Hi, and welcome back to the Cities Reimagined podcast. I'm your voice of choice, Johannes Riegler. And in every episode of the show, we put together conversations just like the one you are about to hear to leave you inspired and become the best change maker you can possibly be. The topic of today is grassroots cultural centers for reimagining cities, and my guest on the show is Tiffany Fukuma, who's the managing director of Trans-Europe Halles. So Trans-Europe Halles is a network of over 160 grassroots cultural initiatives and centers. What these grassroots cultural centers essentially do is reinterpreting space and spaces and giving a new soul and identity to vacant buildings and vacant places. Trans-Europe Halles is around for about 40 years, so for quite a while. And when Tiffany and I met in Umeå in northern Sweden in February 2023 at the conference, we started exchanging and discussing the role of these centers and grassroots initiatives, grassroots cultural initiatives and centers for making urban areas better places to live and making them more sustainable and regenerative. One of the conclusions Tiffany and I drew from this conversation in Umeå in northern Sweden was that we work along the same lines, but the communities are very different. Where the urban transition community is more focused on research and innovation, cities, local public administration, the community around Trans-Europe Halles is more focused on the cultural sector and tackles sustainability and urban transitions from a different angle. But ultimately, the goals are the same or similar or comparable. And this is why I'm very happy to have Tiffany Fukuma on the show today to discuss these topics further, to see what the role of grassroots cultural centers can be and are for urban transitions, and also to find out about Tiffany's personal background, which is a story or a journey between France, Japan, between DIY punk rock and working in embassies. So here is the conversation I had with Tiffany just before Christmas break of 2023. So if you hear a note about a Christmas tree in the background, that's why. Enjoy. Hi, Tiffany.
Hey.
It's so nice having you on Cities Reimagined. Thanks for taking the time. How are you? I see a Christmas tree behind you. Where are you at
Yes,
the moment?
I'm currently in southern France in Toulouse with my family, but I am remote working in front of the Christmas tree, actually. So, but thank you for having me on this podcast. Nice to reconnect too.
Tiffany, can you share a little bit about your personal background? What led you to become involved in Trans-Europe Halles in the first place?
That's a short question, but the answer might be a bit long. When I'm asked this question, usually what I say is I start by saying that I've known Trans-Europe since I was 16. When I was 16, I was a high school student, but I was also organizing punk concerts in basements, and I was living in the French Alps at the time, very small city near Grenoble. At the time, the places to organize these kind of concerts were mostly illegal spaces run by the anarcho-punk scene. And so, well, you can imagine the kind of spaces. It was like literally underground. So it was basement floors. It was not very safe. It was like floors were sticky with beer, and the sound was very loud. And I made friends at the time in Geneva, so on the other side of the border, and they were running a squad called Duplex. And when I discovered the squat scene in Geneva, it was a completely different scene. It was also illegal, but it was in the Ugly Duckling tale, when the ugly duckling meets their family of swans, in the end. I was like, wow, this is unbelievable what they are able to do with basically the same means as we do. They occupy the space illegally, etc. But through the discussions, I figured out that there were a lot of regulations put in place by the city of Geneva at the time that allowed the squatters to stay in the buildings, that there was probably a bigger master plan to gentrify the neighborhood. It was the Grotte neighborhood behind the railway station in Geneva that is now completely gentrified. But so I think it all started with this fascination for how these communities were able to do this. Like, it looked like really fancy contemporary art slash like really cool electronic music venue environments. And so I heard about Trans Europe Pulse for the first time at that time. And I heard that there was this network that was really activist and political at the time, that was really supporting the development of art squats. It was really connected to the squatting scene at the time. Yeah, so it all started like this. But then, and I'm going to
This is
try.
so funny or interesting because there's you're now this. I didn't know about that background from you. I did the same in my hometown where I organized punk and hardcore shows
Mhm.
some 20, 25 years ago. But you're the third person on the show who has a punk and hardcore background and works on urban topics. I find it funny and super interesting
What is
because it
really funny is that I have the same experience of a lot of people from that scene who actually, if they stay long enough in that scene, they always come back at some point to the question of the venues and the buildings, and they get really interested in urban stuff and urban planning. So yeah, I guess there is a strong connection there.
yes. And fast forward to today. Today you're the managing director of Trans Europe Palace, right?
I am, yes.
What happened in between?
So in between, I had a daughter when I was very young, so I had to provide for my daughter. So immediately after I finished my studies, I moved to Japan with her, and I started working in production. And I had an opportunity because I'm half Japanese. I used to speak Japanese to be hired by the embassy, the French embassy in Japan, and basically to become a civil servant for the French government. And when I came back to France years later, I started working for cities. So I worked for the city of Paris at a very interesting moment when the city of Paris was building its strategy to become a metropolis. I mean, it technically was already a metropolis, but it was looking at diplomatic ways to reconnect with its suburbs, and culture was one of the backbones of this strategy. So I was involved in this. And then I also worked for the city of Bordeaux, southwest France, which is a much more like, let's say, provincial city, but with interesting features linked with heritage, like massive city redevelopment, developed and gentrified neighborhoods, and very working class neighborhoods, etc. And both experiences gave me really an interesting approach of how cities were functioning from the inside. And I had to work with, like, social services, with urban institutes, universities, etc. So yeah, it allowed me to really see the connections. But I was basically in both positions working with the associations, with the grassroots organizations on the ground that were subsidized by the city, and developing cultural cooperation projects. So it was just interesting to see the links and to understand the politics also behind it. Then I moved back with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Canada for several years. I was working in Toronto, which was also a really interesting city to be in. Well, it's the city of Richard Florida. It's the city where Jane Jacobs also was teaching for many years. And I was there at the moment where like the Google city was trying to set foot in Toronto. It was also the moment when the city was bidding to have Netflix move in the city, and I got really close to the city departments and also to the grassroots world in Toronto, and started cooperation projects on advocacy, on urban transformation, as well, connecting scenes in France and in Toronto around those.
So it seems your work is very much about connecting different worlds as well, right? With your punk rock, hardcore squatting background, and your work in the cultural field and working with local public administration, but also what you described when you were in Japan, you worked on a national, or you worked for the French embassy, which is the national level. How do you connect these dots, and what excites you about this, bringing together different perspectives?
Originally, I have like really two passions, which are like the alternative cultural scenes, especially the music scene, and also issues of social justice. I was very involved also in the organizations fighting for the rights of immigrants, newcomers, undocumented migrants, emergency housing, and stuff like that. It's funny because when I joined the public service initially, I really was experiencing it as a punishment and something I was doing for to feed myself and my daughter. But very quickly I became really interested in the politics, and especially in the local politics when I was working for cities, like understanding the other side of the mirror and understanding the logics at work behind it, and also understanding how to help those scenes and those communities I used to be working with, and I've always kept working with throughout the years, using basically the framework of public services, and also educating from inside, elected officials or cultural managers on how to work together better. So, in a way, I found myself in the position of a sort of translator between two worlds that often have difficulties communicating. But I've always been, in the position of defending the grassroots, the local organization, because this is really where I see the political transformation happening. And it's really good when you work for cities because you can see it. You can really see the transformations happening.
And I think that links also to your work in Trans Europe Palace, right? It sounds but can you describe a little bit what that organization is and what your work there is mainly about?
Yes, Trans-Europal is it's an international organization. It belongs to the family of European Cultural Network. Trans-Europal was born in 1983. It stemmed from the initiative of three alternative cultural organizers in Brussels, Zurich, and Amsterdam, who were trying to develop projects in their cities, and those projects were repurposing of abandoned buildings to create spaces for those alternative cultures they were defending. And there was no advocacy for these kind of scenes at the time, and repurposing abandoned buildings for arts and culture was not really a thing. So our network was born from that, and since then developed quite a lot. Now we are present in more than 40 countries, 162 members to date. And all of our members come from this grassroots movement, are non-governmental cultural centers, community driven, and all of our members have this common point of having repurposed an abandoned building for arts and culture. So at the beginning of the network, I guess it was mostly industrial buildings that were repurposed, but now really we see all typologies of buildings coming in the network. Like, there was a wave of military buildings with the demilitarization. There's now a lot of commercial buildings coming in with the rise of like online commerce, parking lots coming in, with like remote working, or office buildings coming up. So it's interesting because it follows really also the big movements like big economic transformations and social transformations of cities. So the network evolves like this. And what we do is mostly fundraising for these centers who, of course, don't have a lot of leverage by themselves. Some of our members have been in the network for over 40 years and have grown to be like really big institutions now as we speak. But we keep integrating new members, like small cinemas in Kosovo, underground concert venues, animation, movie, like studios established in repurposed buildings, and in countries like now Azerbaijan or Kosovo, Lebanon. So yeah, so we fundraise for them, we build advocacy for them. A lot of them are still facing issues of eviction, of temporary leases. They still are often in very precarious situations. We also help them develop sustainably, to transform their buildings, to develop sustainable economic models. And the way we do that is by connecting all of these centers together and allowing them to exchange knowledge, experiences, this family feel, and the fact that they can connect, they really know each other.
What
And
I find so interesting in your work, you come towards urban transitions from a more cultural angle and more artistic and cultural perspective toward repurposing empty buildings, old industrial buildings, or as you said now, commercial buildings as well. While my work links to that, but it doesn't come so straight from the cultural perspective. What do you think is the role of cultural sectors in urban development and urbanism, especially when you look at sustainable urbanization or these urban transformations towards sustainable future?
I won't answer for the cultural sector at large. I will answer for the grassroots cultural sector and the non-governmental cultural sector in particular. And I would say that, well, of course, there is a creativity first. That transformation often comes from, an alternative vision of what you can do, and in this case, what you can do with space. Because, for example, at Transeuropas, our members, they are space transformation agents, and with the grassroots communities, what is really interesting, like one of our members was talking about duocracy. It's like there is not too much thinking. There is what you can do with the means that you have, and you do it, and with not much thinking given to whether it is technically possible, it is financially possible, it is like whether it is legal, etc. And you figure it out as you are doing it, basically, which is an approach that is really an experimental approach that all the sector, I notice, has, and that has been having like really, really important effects and impacts on the way like city policy, for example, has evolved. If you think of the city of Berlin and the policy transformation around the clubbing movement in Berlin, it is a really good example. And Amsterdam is, of course, a really good example as well of innovative policy developed around space, but in conversation with the grassroots communities. So again, like I think the grassroots cultural center has this power to imagine the future of cities, to project desires on space. And very often, this is something that is really fascinating to me. The space transformation is not necessarily about how architecturally the space is transforming. It is about how desires of people are affecting like the use of these spaces, and that you can see, a club in a former factory, or you can see a gay space, in a very corporate environment, and this is only about projecting desires. Bringing a community together to actually implement, do, and this is how space is being transformed. Like architectural transformation is sort of a accessory in this process.
And what do you see is the value of that for a larger urban transformation? What is the value of these grassroots cultural centers for a transition towards sustainability or livability or social justice? What is there for the larger city?
Well, cities are about people, right? So the fact that this transformation is led by the people themselves, or the citizens themselves, is for me something very crucial. And I think at the core of all this school of urbanism stemming from Jane Jacobs, like Henri Lefebvre, etc. It's like, reclaiming your right to co-create the city with policymakers in a sort of bottom-up movement and not a top-down approach. So make a more livable cities for the people who live in there, by the people who live there. Also, as I mentioned, there is this force of imagination that often we see especially in urban departments in cities, or at least the cities I used to work at, is really stuck into regulations, and very often, innovative transformation of urban space comes from questioning those regulations and adapting regulations to what needs to happen in that space. And what needs to happen in that space, I think, should be defined by the citizens themselves. This is what we do. And the fact that transformation is done with this approach brings, of course, more sustainability, because the citizens are diverse. The citizens know what problematics they experience in their neighborhood, at a micro local level, like phenomena like segregation, creating common spaces, conviviality spaces, education spaces, etc., leisure spaces, and also livable spaces. A good example that I think we talked about last time we met, Johannes, is for example, we've been working for a year now on the creation of citizen-led energy communities involving cultural centers. So to integrate better the cultural centers in the sustainability plan of their cities themselves, by developing energy production systems in the cultural centers themselves, but in connection with the rest of the cities, with schools, with supermarkets, parking lots, etc., and with the city and with the city governments also. So this is an example also of how this integration can happen from the bottom up and from citizen-led initiatives as well.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, because it also shows that your members, or your understanding of your role, or of the members' role in a larger urban context, right? Because cultural centers could be something catering for a very specific demographic, or for a very specific group of people. You mentioned the Berlin, the techno scene in the, that started because there was a vacuum of regulation, if you will, but it's catered for a very specific group of people who were interested in that. But how do you see this develop, or how do you see that develop in your members? That was there always this understanding that cultural sectors contribute to what is going on outside of, let's say, the walls of the cultural sector as well? How do they link to the residents, and how do they facilitate the creation of these desired urban future you mentioned?
Concerning transfer pals again, members, I think we have one specificity that I mentioned in the beginning. All of our members have repurposed the building. So at some point, they all had to either fight with or collaborate with city governments or regional governments, or they had to engage their entire community, their neighborhood around their project. They had to get people on board. So they all kind of started as micro political movements. Really, that's what they were, and building advocacy for themselves for their projects, which was, were all like urban transformation projects with different levels of negotiations. I think happening with the authorities. Sometimes it was like pretty brutal appropriation of space, in this squatting style, and then starting a long process of negotiation to regularize their presence, or it started with a negotiation, or sometimes it's also a commercial, contractualization. People come together and buy space and redevelop it. So I think at the core there is this engagement that is necessary. But what is interesting in your question is the question of like the segregative aspect of the cultural communities. That cultural communities are known to be, gentrifiers of space. They are known to be exclusive to certain categories of people, and with certain cultures. You see also very obvious social segregation. So I guess in the network, if I want to be perfectly honest, everybody is not at the same level of understanding, also because we are present in 40 different countries, and the contexts are very different from country to country. In terms of how diversity is understood, for example, in terms of what you can negotiate or not negotiate with the local governments. Of course, it's not the same situation in Hungary right now than in the Netherlands, or in. So there are like very different contexts, and I mean, you're in Austria right now. Austria is really is really forward in this reflection of how to how cultural centers are part of a much larger ecosystem, how governance of cultural organization should be reflective of the neighborhoods they are based in, how the programming of the cultural organizations should cater to the populations, where they are localized, how or cultural organizations who have developed this know-how and knowledge of community organizing, of sustainable governances, representative governance, can also educate other cultural institutions and cultural managers at cities, for example, to lead more sustainable practices. It's not the case everywhere, but we have in Transeuropal's movement called the Cultural Transformation Movement that is looking at these processes and at how to integrate these notions of social and spatial justice within the work of the organization. And when I say within the work of the organization, it says every level of the organization. It's like from the governance of the organization to the outputs of the organization, so the programming, etc.
Can you think of one or two examples of your members where you think this is such a good example how they work in a neighborhood or in a city and what they contribute to this neighborhood? How does this very concretely, this cooperation or work with the city administration, how does that function? How is this trust built? Could you think of
Yes.
two examples?
Yes, two examples. So I can talk about this example in Austria I was mentioning. It's in Vienna. It's a center called Brunnenpassage. It's located in I think one of the largest immigrant neighborhoods and marketplaces.
It's
in
Brunnenmarkt, right?
Brunnenmarkt, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And actually the space itself is a commercial halle, like a marketplace that was redeveloped following really principles of complete transparency. So it still looks like it really looks like a passageway, from the market to a plaza behind it. The organization also created a foundation called the Arts, standing for diversity in the arts. It has like very strong governance principles within the organization to have a completely diverse intergenerational governance, direction, etc. And that is reflected through all the aspects of what they do. So the citizens themselves, basically, like they recruited a lot of their staff, including in leadership position within the neighborhood. So and train. They have also these training processes, and through the foundation they created, they are now providing consultancy services for most of the more classic Viennese institutions, the opera, the museums, etc., on how to diversify their teams, on how to diversify their programs, etc. So for me, this is a really virtuous example. And now they are also bringing this model to the network, and are very active in this in spreading this cultural transformation movement and methodology within the grassroots cultural sector through Trans-Europals. And we're leading. They are heavily involved in a project that Trans-Europals is leading, called the Cultural Transformation Movement Project, which is basically a 4 years long experimentation project involving 5 centers that are applying those methodologies to co-production, artistic co-production processes as well. So this is an example. Another interesting example is this example of the small cinema in Kosovo I was mentioning. It's so Kosovo is a rather new state, and we have a member in that is not established in the capital city, that is in Peja. And it was started by animation movie students, basically, who were self-taught because there was no animation school in Kosovo at the time. And they came together to actually do small creations together, share their works, and they ended up organizing a festival, the first animation movie festival in Peja, and very quickly actually became one of the most organized cultural organizations in the country, which was a pretty young country. And when the cultural ministry was created in Kosovo, they reached out to these organizations, who were just a handful, to co-create with them the cultural policies at the national level to serve the youth, to develop infrastructure, funding schemes, etc. And this all happened really fast. I mean, this is a pretty unique situation, but we see similar things happening in Baltic countries, for example, because the grassroots also, like, was the closest to, I guess, what, culture in new countries, like, you need to really, like, perpetuate or create an entire narrative, that is a decolonial narrative, and also a national narrative, of course. And the grassroots, of course, is a really good element to develop this, co-develop this. So I guess that's two examples, but I could come up with examples, of like these energy communities being developed, of centers that have become like entirely energy positive and completely self-sufficient, for example, over the years.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Yes, sure. So one also great example within our network is UFA Fabrik in Berlin. It's one of our oldest standing members. It was started by a hippie commune in the late 70s, who squatted a former factory near Tempelhof in Berlin. So it's like a big factory complex that was making movie film, like UFA. And because they were hippies, that's very interesting. They had from the beginning a very strong ecological ethos, which was not necessarily mainstream at the time, and they integrated those ecological principles from the very beginning of their repurposing project. And in their commune, they had people who became like, engineers, and, there's a physics teacher at the Technical University of Berlin, etc. So they brought together also the academia, they brought the local communities, to help them on the very long term. So it's not like, millions of investment transformation happening in 2 years time, but it's really over 50 years of time, like a very slow and organic transformation with the community, with partnerships built over time, etc. And they integrated those ecological principles and today, if you visit UFA Fabrik, it's really amazing, because so they produce all of their energy, and they produce surplus, like out of renewable energy. So I think it's solar and wind. They are using all of the rainwater, so they have also like these embedded systems that are feeding into like their water systems. They have housing on site for their elderly, so intergenerational housing. They have a free school. They have an urban farm that is also like growing crops that are feeding, like, the restaurants and bakery that is on site, etc. So they created this whole integrated system with the like starting from the commune, but like progressively involving all the local community, and negotiating over time with the city, who of course the occupation was illegal in the beginning, but then, like, gave temporary leases, and now recently gave a lease of over 50 years, I think, to the organization, but after 50 years of being in the space, really. But this is a good example of how you can also support the organic transformation of space on the long term by supporting the grassroots communities, that you don't really need always to invest millions of euros to transform a really huge space, but really support the communities rather, and trust them to transform this space. And UFA Fabrik is now regarded as a model of sustainable urban transformation by a lot of professionals in the field who come and visit. It's the most visited center, I think, in our network for these integrated systems.
How do you see this building of trust between the organizations and the local public administration, for example? Because I think this is not a trivial one, right? You mentioned a couple of cases like in Kosovo and in Berlin, where these organizations might have picked up in times where there was a weak state or a situation which is not very well defined, let's say, like compared to Austria, where we have a very, Austria is a very administrative country. We have administrative rules for everything. And what I sense here is that there is, by local public administration, there is the ambition to control these kind of organizations in one way or the other, be it with funding or means. But there is, depending on in which city you are in, there's not too much trust towards these kind of new organizations or new methods of developing space. Not new methods, but these kind of alternative methods of experimenting with the space and giving it new life or identity. How do you see that in your work?
I think it's changed quite a lot. It's definitely changed from the moment we started. I think that you're right when you're saying that our centers usually start in sort of gray areas or loopholes of policy, but because usually they like all of our centers are established in abandoned spaces. Abandoned places, and those places are not abandoned for nothing. They are abandoned because there was an activity there. There was an industrial activity, there was rich commercial activity, etc. And because of social transformations or economic transformation, these places became redundant, and the politicians usually struggle to find new uses or new usages for these spaces. They understand the value of the land, but usually the how to revitalize space is pretty complicated. This is, of course, where a lot of our initiatives were born. But what we've seen, of course, a lot in the past years with the phenomenons like financiarization of real estate in very dense cities, where like the price of the square meter is like skyrocketing completely, is that there were like a lot of phenomenons of artists and cultural workers leaving the cities altogether. And we had a wave of development actually of cultural centers in rural or peripheric areas. Then the cities have to face another issue, which is that the issue of the brain drain, or the issue of losing their creators who are also creating the attractivity of the city. And cities now almost all understand that they have to keep like a mixity of people in their cities, and to preserve spaces for that. So what is really interesting to witness now is how those cities who face these phenomenons are actually coming to consult with us to understand how they can develop models where they can safeguard spaces, where they can actually entrust the local communities to develop sustainable spaces for cultural communities, for neighbors, young people, etc. In the city. I forgot the initial question, but I think I kind of...
Me too, no worries. Right, we are about to come to an end to the conversation. What are 3 things to learn from your work for a larger urban transformation as such?
3 things. maybe this learning, that something I heard actually from an urbanist, Brazilian urbanist, that if you trust communities or individuals, they at a very micro local level, like everybody has an own interest to improve their environment, and it doesn't require a lot of investment. It is actually usually much cheaper and much more sustainable to support grassroots communities and to trust them that on the long term they will improve space. That's what happened in Geneva. And you have many mechanisms through which you can do this that are not very costly for local government. And from the moment you build this trust with local actors and grassroots actors, they will do their best to transform space, and usually in a very creative way, an unusual way. And this will, in turn, I think, create attractivity for the city, originality, aesthetics, social value. So this is the first thing. The second thing is, of course, like, something that is now, I think, universal in architecture conversations, but like, it's don't destroy and rebuild, transform. Like, there's so, especially in Europe, there is so much to work with already, and all the knowledge is here. It is possible it is much more ecological, it is much more sustainable for the communities who are there to transform and revitalize those spaces than to get rid of them and build very unsustainable new spaces. The last thing is, like, connect with different sectors, different initiatives, different geographies, different political environment, to understand and take learnings from what other cities, what other actors were able to do, how they were able to, so that you don't have to do all the work from scratch again, but you're able to bring, like, proof of concept to your local authorities, saying, look, it worked in Amsterdam, it worked in Kosovo, like, we can make it happen here too. Usually there's a lot of fear about, like, overcoming regulation, about giving trust, but once you show results, economic development results, like, sustainable urban development results, usually policymakers are more prone to just accepting that this is a sustainable model of transformation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tiffany. It was so nice to have you on the show on Cities Reimagined.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time, and I hope we have the chance to meet again, either in northern Sweden or somewhere else.
Yes, after the end of this wonderful time you took off to create this intellectual contents and everything.
Yes, right.
Hopefully.
So after March, hopefully.
Yes.
Right, then have, I hope, still a nice and relaxed Christmas break. And see you soon.
Bye.
Yes, that's all for this week. If you liked the content and if you liked what you heard, please rate the show, leave a comment, and follow us on Instagram or get in touch on LinkedIn or via email. That is johannes@anthropocene.city. We have a couple of more shows to go in the season 1 of Cities Reimagined before we take a little break and sum up what has been discussed on the show so far. But in the meantime, I hope you are having a good one, and I hope to catch you soon.